The station master read the manifest twice and still couldn't make sense of it. One bride, one trunk, one wooden crate, 200 pounds of corn seeds, addressed to a cattle ranch in the driest county in the state. Wyatt Hayes stood on that platform staring at it, and the woman standing next to it stared back at him, and she spoke before he did. "Don't look at the crate like it's the problem," she said. "Look at your land like it's the answer." He almost laughed. He almost sent her back. Instead, he said, "Lady, this ranch just got richer." He had no idea how completely he was right. If this story already has you subscribed to this channel right now, leave a comment below telling me what city you're watching from, and don't you dare walk away. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Silver Creek, where a cowboy just met the last woman on earth he expected and the only one he'd ever need. Wyatt Hayes had written that letter on a Thursday night in February, sitting at a table with a cracked leg he'd been meaning to fix for 6 months. The lamp was low on oil. The fire was down to coals. Outside, the wind cut across Silver Creek like it was looking for something to ruin. And inside, Wyatt sat there with a piece of paper and the uncomfortable feeling that he was about to do something a man shouldn't have to do. He wasn't a man who asked for help. He'd built the Hayes Ranch on stubbornness and 14-hour days, same as his father, before him, same as the land demanded. But the drought had been going on 3 years now, and 3 years had a way of grinding a man down to something he didn't recognize in the mirror. His foreman, Pete Dunbar, had suggested it first. "You need a woman, Wyatt." "I need rain." "Well, one of those you can actually order." Wyatt had laughed. Then he'd stopped laughing. Then he'd sat down and written the letter. He kept it simple. He was 34. He owned land 240 acres, mostly dry. He ran cattle, though the herd had thinned these past 2 years. He wasn't much for talking, but he wasn't cruel. He needed someone practical. Someone who understood that a ranch wasn't a comfortable life. Someone who wouldn't expect poetry and wouldn't fall apart when the work got hard. He didn't say he was lonely. He didn't say the house felt like a cave he'd been living inside so long he'd forgotten what sunlight felt like. He just said practical woman, practical arrangement, and he mailed the letter before he could change his mind. 6 weeks later, he got a letter back. Her name was Eliza Boone. She was 29, from a farming family in Ohio. Her father recently passed. She wrote in straight, clean sentences, no flourishes, no apologies, no softness. She said she understood hard work. She said she didn't need a man to take care of her, only a place worth putting down roots. She said she had something to bring with her that she'd explain when she arrived. Wyatt read that last line 3 times. He didn't know what it meant. He decided it didn't matter. He wrote back, "Come in April." She came in April, and what stepped off the train in Silver Creek was not what the letter had prepared him for. He'd built a picture in his head over those 6 weeks, not intentionally, just the way a mind fills in what it doesn't know. He'd imagined someone quiet, a little worn down by circumstance, someone who needed the arrangement as much as he did, maybe more. Someone he could be kind to, without it costing him anything complicated. Eliza Boone walked off that train like she already owned the ground under her boots. She was tall for a woman, dark hair pulled back without ceremony. She wore a practical traveling dress, dusty from the journey, and she carried herself with the specific kind of calm that doesn't come from ease. It comes from knowing exactly who you are, even when everything around you is uncertain. She looked around the platform, spotted him. He was hard to miss, 6'2", with a jaw like a fence post, and she walked straight toward him without hesitation. "Mr. Hayes." "Miss Boone." She shook his hand, firm, businesslike. She didn't smile, and she didn't look nervous, and that alone was enough to knock him slightly sideways. "There's a crate," she said immediately. "I need you to arrange for it to be transported to the ranch before anything else." He looked past her. 2 station workers were standing over a wooden crate roughly the size of a steamer trunk, both of them holding their backs like they'd already regretted helping with it. "What's in it?" Wyatt asked. "Seeds," she said. He waited for more. She didn't offer more. Seeds, he repeated. Corn seeds mostly, some winter wheat, a few varieties my father developed over 20 years of work. She said it the way someone says something they've already had to defend too many times and are no longer interested in defending. They're going with me wherever I go. That was never negotiable. Wyatt stood there for a moment looking at the crate, then looking at her, doing a very fast internal calculation about what exactly he'd gotten himself into. I run cattle, he said carefully. I know. She turned and started walking toward the wagon. But your land is dying, Mr. Hayes. Cattle alone won't fix that. He almost said something sharp. He swallowed it. He told himself he'd have that conversation later, once they were off the platform and away from the 6 or 7 Silver Creek residents who were already watching this exchange with undisguised interest. He arranged for the crate. He helped load her trunk. He climbed up beside her on the wagon seat, and they rode out of town, and for the first 3 miles, neither of them said a word. It was Eliza who broke it. How many acres are you actually farming? None, he said. I told you I run cattle. I know what you told me. I'm asking what you're doing with the land. The land's dry. Nothing grows on it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, what did it grow before the drought? Some grass. Native grasses mostly. Nothing useful. Was there ever corn? Not on my land. But in the region. He frowned. Maybe. 20-30 years back before the water table dropped. Why? She didn't answer right away. She was looking out at the land on either side of the road, really looking, the way a person looks when they're calculating something, not just seeing. After a long pause, she said, The land isn't dead, Mr. Hayes. It's been misread. He nearly laughed. He caught it before it came out because something about her tone made laughing feel rude. With respect, Miss Boone, I've been working this land for 15 years. With cattle, she said simply. He decided to let it go. They could have that argument another time too. They reached the ranch as the sun was dropping toward the horizon. He showed her the house, the main room, the kitchen, the bedroom he'd set up for her at the back, which was small but had a decent window, and he'd made a point of having Pete sweep it out before he left that morning. She walked through without comment, running her hand along the kitchen counter, checking the stove opening and closing the window. Then she said, Where's your water source? Creek about a quarter-mile east. There's a channel that runs toward the pasture. How deep is the creek running now? About half what it was 10 years ago. And the soil on the east pasture, is it clay-heavy or sandy? Wyatt stared at her. I don't know the exact soil composition of my own pasture, Miss Boone. She nodded like that was useful information. I'll need to test it tomorrow. Test it. Yes, the seeds need specific conditions. I need to know what I'm working with before I plant anything. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think we should talk. All right. They sat at the table with the cracked leg. He folded his hands on the top of it and looked at her directly. I wrote that letter because I needed help running this ranch. Help with the house, with the cooking, with managing things when I'm out with the cattle. This wasn't meant to be. He stopped, rearranged. I don't know what you're planning, Miss Boone, but I want to be straight with you. I don't have the money or the water to start a farming operation. She met his eyes steadily. I'm not asking you for money. You're asking me for land use. I'm asking you to let me try, she said. You lose nothing if I fail. But if I'm right about that east pasture, if the soil still has what I think it has, you won't be running this operation on cattle alone this time next year. He looked at her for a long time. And what do you get out of it? Something moved behind her eyes. Not softness, exactly, more like the closest thing to vulnerability she'd let herself show since she stepped off that train. A life I built, she said. Something that's mine. Wyatt didn't answer immediately. He was a man who made decisions slowly, who turned things over and looked at them from multiple angles before he committed. But he also knew somewhere in the part of him that ran on instinct rather than reason that there was something happening here that was bigger than a corn crop. He just didn't know what it was yet. "All right," he said. "Try." She gave him a single nod. Not a smile. Not gratitude. Just acknowledgement, like a business partner closing on a deal. Then she stood up and went to start supper. He sat at the table for a while after she left the room, listening to her move around in his kitchen, quietly, efficiently, like she'd already mapped the space in her head. And he thought about that crate of seeds sitting in his barn right now, and about the east pasture, and about a woman who'd come 1,000 miles, not to be rescued, but to build something. He thought, this is either the smartest thing I've ever done or the most complicated. He didn't know yet which one it was. The next morning, she was up before him. That had never happened with anyone else on the ranch. Wyatt was a 4:30 man, always had been up and moving before the sky decided what color it wanted to be. He came out of his bedroom pulling on his shirt and found the kitchen warm, the coffee made, and Eliza already at the table with a piece of paper in front of her, covered in small, neat handwriting. He poured a cup and looked over her shoulder without asking. It was a diagram. Rough hand-drawn but precise a layout of what he recognized as the east pasture, divided into sections with notations beside each one in terms he didn't fully understand. Drainage indicators, depth markers. Something labeled soil retention with a question mark beside it. "You drew this from memory?" he asked. "From what I could see from the road yesterday." "It's accurate." She looked up at him. "I know." He sat down across from her and drank his coffee and watched her work. She wasn't performing. She wasn't trying to impress him. She was just working the way people work when the problem in front of them is more interesting than anything else in the room. After a few minutes, she said without looking up, "I'll need a shovel. I've got 6. I'll only need 1. She paused. "And I'd appreciate if you'd come with me. You know the land better than any diagram." That stopped him. He hadn't expected to be asked for anything. He'd already started building a mental arrangement where she did her thing, and he did his, and they stayed out of each other's way except at meals. "All right," he said. They went out to the east pasture in the early gray of the morning, and she dug. Not a little she dug properly, putting her whole back into it, going down 2 feet, before she stopped and crouched at the edge of the hole and started pulling out handfuls of soil and breaking them apart between her fingers. He stood beside her and watched. "Talk to me about this land," she said. "What do you want to know? What did your father do with it?" "Grazed. Same as me." "And before him, when the county was first settled?" Wyatt thought about it. "There was a family here before us, the Alcotts. They farmed, I think. Didn't last long, 3-4 years. Moved on." "Why?" "Drought. Same drought that's been chasing everyone." She was quiet, turning soil in her hands. "This part of the pasture, the drainage is different here. Do you know why?" "There's a slight dip in the ground maybe 100 yards south of here. Water collects there after rain." She stood up immediately. "Show me." He showed her. She stood at the edge of the low spot and looked at it for a long time without speaking, long enough that he started to feel impatient. "Miss Boone, the Alcotts didn't fail because the land was bad," she said suddenly. "They failed because they didn't understand where the water goes." She turned to him. "The moisture in this area doesn't run off the way it does further north. It sinks here, slowly. It stays in the subsoil longer than anyone would think just by looking at the surface." He crossed his arms. "And that means?" "It means I can grow corn here." He stared at her. "In a drought. With the right variety." She said it firmly, no apology, no room for argument. "My father spent 15 years developing a strain that can work with deep subsoil moisture. He tested it in conditions worse than this. It works." The silence stretched between them. Out in the distance, one of his cattle lowed. The wind pushed dust across the dry surface of the pasture. "Everyone's going to say you're wrong," he told her. "I know." She didn't flinch at that. Are you going to say it too? He looked at the low spot in the ground. He looked at this woman standing in his dead pasture talking about his land like she could see something underneath it that he'd never thought to look for. He thought about 15 years of watching this place slowly dry out. He thought about that letter he'd written on a cracked table by a dying lamp. Not yet, he said. She nodded. She went back to work. The town of Silver Creek took about 4 days to fully process the news. By the end of the first week, every person from the feed store to the church steps had an opinion about Wyatt Hayes' mail-order bride and her crate of corn seeds. Most of the opinions were unkind. Hattie Graves, who ran the dry goods store and functioned as the unofficial distribution center of all Silver Creek gossip, had the most complete picture. She delivered it to anyone who came in for flour or thread. She dragged a full wooden crate off the train. Seeds, they say. She's planning to plant corn on Hayes land. Corn won't grow in Silver Creek, whoever she was talking to would say. That's what I said. Hattie would nod. Poor thing's clearly not right in the head, or else she's just never seen real drought. Wyatt heard this secondhand from Pete, who'd heard it directly from a woman named Clara who'd been in the store buying ribbon. He didn't say anything to Pete about it. He went home and found Eliza at the kitchen table again, this time with 3 small containers of soil lined up in front of her, each one from a different depth, each labeled in her careful handwriting. She was comparing them, making notes. People in town are talking, he said. I'm sure they are. They don't think this is going to work. She looked up. Do you? He was honest. I don't know yet. She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her expression shifted. Not hurt, not defensive, but thoughtful, like she was deciding something about him. That's a better answer than most people would give, she said, and she went back to her soil samples. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than he needed to, then went to see about the cattle. The planting started on a Tuesday. She marked the ground herself using wooden stakes and a length of rope, laying out rows with a precision that made Pete stop and stare from across the fence. She measured that, Pete said to Wyatt, voice low. Yes. To the inch. Looks like. Pete scratched his jaw. Where'd she learn all this? Her father. Pete was quiet a moment. Then, what happened to him? Died last winter. Pete nodded slowly. He watched Eliza drive the last stake stand up, brush the dirt from her hands, and start walking the rows she'd laid out with that same contained, focused calm. She didn't bring those seeds because she had nowhere else to take them, did she? It wasn't exactly a question. Wyatt didn't answer it like one. No, he said. She brought them because this is what she planned all along. He said it without thinking. Only after it was out did he realize what it meant, that she hadn't come to Silver Creek because she needed to be placed somewhere. She'd come because she'd chosen it. She'd looked at the letters available to her, and she'd chosen his land, his specific land, because something in what he'd described told her what she needed to know about the soil and the water and the possibility hiding underneath the surface of this dying place. She hadn't come to be saved. She'd come because she already knew what she was going to do here. He stood at the fence and watched her begin to plant, pressing each seed into the earth at exactly the depth and interval her notes prescribed, and something in his chest moved that he hadn't felt move in a very long time. He didn't have a name for it yet. He went back to work. By the end of the second week, she had 73 rows planted. Wyatt had stopped doubting the method. He hadn't started believing yet, not quite, but doubt required energy he didn't have time for, and what he was seeing was too precise, too intentional to dismiss. She wasn't guessing. She was executing a plan she'd carried inside her for longer than she'd been in Silver Creek, and every step was exactly what she said it would be. He started asking questions. Not challenging questions, real ones. He'd come out to the pasture in the early afternoon, when the worst of the sun had passed, and he'd walk the rows with her, and ask about the seed depth, or the watering schedule, or how she managed the drainage problem on the north end of the planting area. She answered everything directly. No condescension, no impatience. She talked to him like he was worth talking to. He hadn't realized until that second week how rarely anyone talked to him that way. Pete teased him about it once, lightly in passing. "You're spending a lot of time in that east pasture, boss." "It's my land," Wyatt said. "Sure it is." Pete smiled and didn't say anything else. It was a Thursday evening, the 15th day since she'd arrived, when Wyatt came in from a long day in the south pasture and found Eliza sitting at the table with a letter in front of her. She wasn't reading it. She was sitting with her hands flat on the table on either side of it, and her face was showing something he hadn't seen on it before. He stopped inside the door. "Bad news." She looked up, composed herself so fast he almost missed that she'd needed to. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing. What's the letter?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "It's from a man named Harlan Crow." Wyatt went still. He knew that name. Everyone in Silver Creek knew that name. "What does Crow want?" he said, and his voice was careful in a way that had nothing to do with being gentle. She looked at him steadily. "He wants to buy the ranch." The silence in the room changed quality. Wyatt pulled out the chair across from her and sat down and put his hands on the table, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. "He's been wanting this land for 3 years, Wyatt said. "I know." She nodded at the letter. "He says he's prepared to offer a fair price. He says the land isn't worth what you think it is." She paused. "He says the farming operation on the east pasture is a foolish gamble, and you'd be wise to sell before you waste more money on it." Wyatt's jaw tightened. "He knows about the corn." "He knows." "In 2 weeks." He looked at her. "Someone told him." "In a town this size," she said, "someone always tells." He sat back. He was quiet for long enough that she spoke again. "He'll come with a better offer next," she said. "And if that doesn't work, he'll find another way." She said it matter-of-factly, without alarm, like she'd seen this before. "Men like Crow always do." He looked at her. "You've dealt with men like Crow." "My father did." Something crossed her face, grief old and contained the kind that doesn't announce itself anymore. "He lost his farm to a man not much different. It's why I left Ohio." She met his eyes. "I didn't come all the way here to let it happen again." Wyatt looked at the letter. He looked at Eliza. He thought about 73 rows of corn seeds pressing into the subsoil of his east pasture, carrying 15 years of a dead man's work. He thought about what was buried in that land that Harlan Crow didn't know about yet. He thought, "You have no idea what you just started." "Write him back," Wyatt said. She raised an eyebrow slightly. "What should I say?" He stood up. "Tell him no." He pulled on his jacket. "Tell him no, and tell him clearly so there's no confusion about it." She looked at him for a moment. Something passed between them. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the specific understanding of two people who have just decided to stand in the same direction. "All right," she said. He went out to check the horses for the night. When he came back inside an hour later, the letter was written, sealed, and sitting on the table ready for the morning post. He didn't read it. He trusted what she'd written. He didn't ask himself why. He just put out the lamp and went to bed. And somewhere under 73 rows of dark Silver Creek soil, the first seeds were already deciding what they were going to become. Harlan Crow did not respond to the letter. That was the first sign that something was wrong. Men like Crow always responded. They sent polished words wrapped around veiled threats, gave you the feeling of a conversation while they were already 3 moves ahead. Silence from a man like that wasn't retreat. It was preparation. Wyatt knew it. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew it, and knowing it put a low-grade tension in his shoulders that didn't leave when he slept and didn't soften when he worked. He went about his days cattle water management fence line on the south pasture, and he carried that silence from Crow the way you carry a stone in your boot. Always there, never comfortable. Eliza noticed. She didn't ask directly. That wasn't her way. But 2 mornings after the letter went out, she put a second cup of coffee on the table before he'd asked for it and said without looking up from her seed journal, "He's not going to come at this straight." "No," Wyatt agreed. "So we don't wait for him to come at it straight." She finally looked up. "We move faster than he expects us to." "The corn isn't going to grow any faster because Harlan Crow is impatient." "No," she said. "But we can change what he thinks he knows." He watched her. "What does that mean?" She closed the journal. "It means most of his advantage right now is information. He knows we're planting. He knows where. He doesn't know if it's working." She held his gaze. What if he started hearing things that made him uncertain? Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "You want to spread rumors about your own crop. I want to spread uncertainty." The difference in her voice was precise and deliberate. "There's a gap between those two things, Mr. Hayes." He thought about it. He turned it over. It had the flavor of something his father would have called underhanded, but his father had also died with a mortgaged ranch, and a pride that hadn't done him much practical good, so Wyatt had learned to think about things on their own terms. "Pete goes into town every Saturday," he said slowly. "I know. He talks. I know that too." She picked up her journal again. "He doesn't have to lie. He just has to mention that the soil tests came back complicated, that the planting has been slower than expected, that you're reconsidering the east pasture." She paused. "Nothing untrue, just incomplete." Wyatt almost smiled. He caught it before it arrived. "Who taught you to think like that?" She was already writing again. "My father spent 30 years fighting men who wanted his land. He lost eventually." She didn't look up. "I was paying attention the whole time." He took the second cup of coffee she'd poured him and went out to find Pete. Pete Dunbar was not a complicated man, and that was one of the things Wyatt valued most about him. He did what he was asked. He asked sensible questions when he needed to, and he didn't add flourishes to anything. When Wyatt explained what he needed, Pete nodded twice and said, "So basically, I just talk about problems that you may or may not have observed." "Right." Pete thought about it. "I can do that. Hattie Graves will do the rest for me." "That's the idea." Pete glanced toward the east pasture. "Is it actually working? The corn?" Wyatt looked in the same direction. It had been 18 days since the planting. Nothing was visible yet from this distance. Nothing that would mean anything to someone who didn't already know where to look. "Ask me in another week," he said. Pete nodded. He went to saddle his horse for the Saturday ride. Wyatt went to the east pasture. Eliza was already there. She was crouched at the end of the third row, still in the early morning, her fingers working carefully through the top layer of soil at the base of one of her planting points. She didn't hear him come up behind her, or if she did, she didn't react. He stopped beside her and looked down, and he saw it. It was the smallest thing, barely a suggestion, a thread of green so pale it was almost colorless, pushing up through the gray-brown surface of the soil. One shoot, not even an inch, less than an inch. But it was there, and it was real, and it was exactly where she'd told him it would be. He didn't say anything for a moment. She looked up at him. "Third row, 8th position," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were doing something different. Something bright and tightly controlled the way a person looks when they've been waiting on something for a very long time and don't quite trust it yet. 2 days earlier than I projected. He crouched down beside her. 2 days early is good. 2 days early means the subsoil moisture is higher than I measured. She sat back on her heels, which means the whole east pasture might have more in it than I thought. He looked at the tiny shoot. A hair of green in dead land. "How many others?" "I checked 6 rows this morning. 4 of them are showing." She paused. "The other 2 will come." He stayed crouched beside her for a moment longer. He thought about the letter to Crow. He thought about Crow's silence. He thought about Pete in town today, dropping careful words into Hattie Graves's ear. He thought, whatever's coming, let it come. Something is growing here that wasn't growing before. He stood up. Don't tell Pete yet. Don't tell anyone. She looked up at him. I wasn't planning to. He went back to work. The shift started small, the way shifts always do. It was Clara Hensley who brought it to Wyatt's attention, and Clara did it the way she did most things, without meaning to cause trouble, and without fully understanding that she was. She stopped him outside the feed store on a Wednesday and said with the particular concern of a woman who genuinely wished everyone well, I heard it's been hard going with the East pasture. Wyatt looked at her evenly. Where'd you hear that? Oh, just around. She fidgeted with her basket handle. People are saying the soil didn't take the way she expected, that maybe it wasn't as promising as she thought. A pause. Some folks are saying she might have been wrong about the land. Some folks, he said. You know how people talk. She had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. I just wanted you to know that nobody's saying it unkindly, Wyatt. They feel bad for her. For both of you. He nodded. He said, that's kind of them. He went inside and bought his feed and rode home. And when he told Eliza what Clara had said, Eliza set down the cup she was holding and looked at the table for a long moment. It worked, she said finally. Seems like. That means crows heard it. That's the assumption. She picked up her cup again. Her expression had the calm of someone who'd just confirmed a calculation and was already moving on to the next one. He'll hold off now. He thinks we're struggling. He thinks he can wait us out, and the land will come to him for less. That's what I think too. Then we have a window. She met his eyes. We need to use it. The window was 3 weeks. 3 weeks during which the corn grew in silence, visible only to the two of them, and when they finally had to be told, Pete and his wife Ruth, who came out to the east pasture one afternoon and stood at the edge of the rows and looked at the green lines pushing up from the gray earth and didn't say a word for a full minute. It was Ruth who broke first. Lord, she said softly. Pete had his hat off, that was all. He just stood there with his hat in his hands and looked, and Wyatt, watching him, thought he understood something about hope that he hadn't had access to in a long time, what it looked like on someone else's face when they'd stopped expecting it. How? Pete finally said. The subsoil, Eliza said beside him. She wasn't performing. She was just explaining the way she always explained things directly, precisely, no embellishment. The land holds more water than anyone realized. You just have to know where the moisture sits and give the roots a reason to go looking for it. Pete looked at her. He looked at the corn. He looked at Wyatt. You knew, he said to Wyatt. I didn't know. I believed. Same difference. Wyatt didn't argue with that. The trouble started on a Friday morning, and it started with the water. Wyatt was out at the south pasture checking the fence line when Pete came riding hard across the field, which Pete never did without reason. Wyatt met him halfway and knew from the set of Pete's shoulders before he was close enough to hear words that something had gone wrong. The channel, Pete said, pulling up. The irrigation channel off the creek. Something's blocking the intake. Wyatt was already moving. Debris. Not debris. Pete's jaw was tight. Rocks. Packed in deliberate. The flows down to a trickle. Wyatt felt the cold come into him. Not anger, not yet, just a very clear, very quiet recognition of what this was. He rode to the channel. He looked at the intake. The rocks were wedged in systematically, not the way water carries things, not the way debris piles up. This was a man's work. 2 men, maybe 3. Done at night or early morning when no one was watching. He crouched at the edge of the intake and looked at the trickle that was left and thought about the east pasture and what it needed to keep growing. He thought about Harlan Crow. He rode back to the house. Eliza was in the kitchen when he came in, and she read his face before he said a word. She stood up from the table. What happened? The irrigation intake. Someone blocked it. She didn't make a sound, but he watched the color change in her face. not fear something hotter and harder than fear. And then she was still again and thinking. "How long before the rows dry out?" he asked. She was already calculating. "At the current growth stage, maybe 4 days, 5 if the subsoil moisture holds." She looked at him. "How fast can you clear it? I can get the rocks out today, but if they did it once, they'll do it again." "I know." She moved past him to the window. He could almost hear her thinking. "We need someone watching the intake. I can't pull men off the cattle to watch the creek." "No." She turned. "But you can ask some of those ranchers on either side of you who also use that water." He stopped. He hadn't thought of that. "The McCready brothers," he said slowly. "They draw from the same creek. And they have as much reason as you to protect that intake." He looked at her. "You think Crow blocked their water too?" "I think he chose yours because yours was the priority." She met his eyes. "But the McCreadys don't know that. And they won't want to wait until he gets to them." He grabbed his hat. He was at the door when she said his name. "Wyatt." He looked back. She was standing in the middle of the room, and she was holding herself very straight, and he could see in her face clearly now something she didn't usually let show the actual weight of what this cost her. Not drama, not tears, just the bare fact of someone who had carried something for a very long time and was feeling the full mass of it in this moment. "I didn't come here to lose this," she said. The words were quiet and completely level, and they hit him harder than anything loud would have. "I know," he said. "Neither did I." He went to find the McCready brothers. Tom McCready was a blunt man who didn't like Wyatt Hayes, especially because they'd argued over fence lines twice in the last 5 years and once over a stray bull. But he was a fair man, and he understood water, the way every rancher in a drought country understood water as the difference between survival and ruin. When Wyatt told him what he'd found at the intake, Tom's face went hard in a way that had nothing to do with their history. "You got any proof it was Crow's men?" Tom said. "No proof. But you know whose land is upstream, and you know who's been trying to buy every acre in this valley for 3 years. Tom was quiet. His younger brother Cal stood behind him, arms crossed, saying nothing. Cal was the smarter of the two, and everyone knew it, including Tom. "He's not wrong," Cal said. Tom looked at his brother. "I know he's not wrong." He looked back at Wyatt. "What do you want?" "I want someone on that intake at night, rotating, your men and mine." Tom crossed his arms. "And in return that water keeps flowing to both our properties and Crow doesn't get to decide who survives this drought." The silence lasted long enough that Wyatt kept himself from pushing. He'd said what needed saying. Either Tom McCready understood it or he didn't, and no amount of additional words was going to change that calculation. "All right," Tom said. "Cal'll set it up." Wyatt nodded. He turned to go. Tom said, "Hayes." He turned back. "They say your wife's growing corn on that east pasture." Tom's voice was neutral, but there was something in it, not mockery, not quite. More like a man preparing to be surprised. "She is." "They say it's not going to work." "A lot of people say that." "What do you say?" Wyatt thought about those green rows in the early morning. He thought about Eliza crouched over that first shoot, her eyes doing that bright controlled thing. "I say come and look at it yourself in 2 weeks, he said. "Then tell me what you think." Tom said nothing, but he didn't say no. He told Eliza about the McCreadys that evening, and she listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she said, "Good. Just that. Good." And then she asked about the water flow and whether the intake had been fully cleared. He'd almost gotten used to it, the way she received everything. Not cold, not indifferent, but conserved. Like she'd learned at some point that the energy she spent reacting was energy not spent solving, and she'd made a decision about which one mattered more. Almost gotten used to it. That night he woke at 2 in the morning and lay in the dark for a while before he understood what had woken him. A sound. Not loud. From outside, from the direction of the east pasture. He was up and dressed and out the door in 2 minutes. What he found was Eliza. She was in the east pasture in the dark, moving along the rows with a lantern low in her hand, checking each one at soil level. Her lips moving slightly as she counted something to herself. She didn't look up when he came alongside her. "I heard a sound," she said before he could ask. "I thought I needed to check." "Everything all right?" "Yes." She kept moving. "Yes, it's fine. It was just wind." He walked beside her. Neither of them spoke. He held the lantern when she needed both hands to check a row, and they moved in silence through 73 rows of corn in the middle of a Silver Creek night, and by the time they reached the end of the last row, something had shifted between them that neither of them had language for yet. She stood at the end of the rows and lifted her face toward the sky, and let out a breath that held more in it than she probably meant to let him hear. "It's going to make it," she said quietly. Not to him exactly, just out loud, like she was telling something she'd been afraid to believe. He stood beside her and said nothing for a moment. Then, "I know." She turned her head and looked at him. In the lantern light, her face was open in a way he'd never seen it, the careful composure gone for just this moment, and he saw in her cleanly the full weight of what she'd brought to this place. Not just the seeds. Everything. Her father's years of work. Her own belief when no one else shared it. The particular courage of a person who bets everything on something invisible. He thought, "I am looking at the bravest person I have ever met." He didn't say it. He wasn't a man who said things like that easily, and this wasn't the moment to become one. He just said, "Come inside, it's cold." She pulled herself back together so quietly it was barely visible. "Yes." She picked up the lantern. "Thank you for coming out." "It's my pasture," he said. "It's not just your pasture anymore," she said, and she walked back to the house. He stood there a moment longer, looking at the rows he couldn't see in the dark, only knew were there. She was right. It wasn't just his anymore. He didn't know exactly when that had happened. He just knew it was true. The way you know something has changed. Wait before you can say what's different. He turned and followed the light back to the house. And in the creek, half a mile east, Tom McCready's son sat quiet in the dark, with a rifle across his knees, watching the intake for anyone who might come to take the water away. Tom McCready came to the east pasture on a Thursday morning 12 days after Wyatt had stood in his yard and told him to come see for himself. He didn't announce it. He just rode up, tied his horse at the fence, and walked the rows in silence with his hat in his hand, the same way Pete had done, and when he reached the end, he stood there for a long time without speaking. Eliza was at the far end of the field, checking the growth markers she'd driven into the soil at planting. She'd clocked Tom's arrival the moment he came through the gate, and she'd kept working deliberately, the way she always kept working when someone came to look, not ignoring them, just not performing for them either. Tom walked to her. "How tall will they get?" he asked. "Full height, 8-9 feet by August if the moisture holds." She didn't look up from her notebook. "These rows will be shoulder high by early July." Tom was quiet. Then, "My grandfather grew corn. Before the drought came in '58. Said there was nothing in the world like a good corn stand in July." Eliza looked up then. Something in her face softened just slightly. He was right. Tom turned and looked at the rows again. At the green that was undeniable now, not a thread of a suggestion like it had been 3 weeks ago, but actual plants, actual height leaves unfurling with the specific confidence of something that has decided it belongs where it is. "Crow's going to come harder when he sees this," Tom said. "Yes," Eliza said. "You ready for that?" She closed her notebook. She looked at Tom McCready with the directness that Wyatt had learned meant she was about to say something she'd already thought through completely. "I've been ready for that since before I got on the train in Ohio, Mr. McCready." Tom looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his hat back on. "Kell'll keep the watch on the intake. Tell Hayes we'll keep it up as long as needed." He walked back to his horse and rode out without ceremony. And Eliza watched him go, and when she turned back to her rows, there was something in her posture that hadn't been there before, not relief exactly, but the particular steadiness of someone who has just confirmed they are not as alone as they feared. Wyatt had watched the whole thing from the fence. When she looked his way, he just nodded. She nodded back. They both went back to work. The second letter from Harlan Crow arrived on a Monday, and this one was not polished. The first letter had been careful. Formal language, reasonable tone, the surface texture of a fair business offer. This one was stripped of all that. It was 2 paragraphs direct, and what it said under the professional language was simple. The price he'd offered before was the best Wyatt would see, the land wasn't worth what Wyatt thought it was, and decisions made in sentiment rather than sense had a way of costing men everything. Wyatt read it at the kitchen table. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at Eliza, who was watching him from across the table. "He's nervous," she said. "He's threatening. Same thing from a man like Crow." She turned the letter toward herself and read it again. "He heard about the corn. The real corn, not Pete's version. Someone told him what it actually looks like now. The McCreadys. No, Tom McCready's not that kind of man." She set the letter down. "Someone from town came out here. I saw a man I didn't know on the road past the east pasture fence last week. I should have said something." Wyatt looked at her. "You didn't know who he was. I thought he was just passing through." She said it with the specific quiet of someone holding themselves accountable. "I should have asked." He was quiet a moment. He wasn't going to make it worse than it was. Crow would have found out eventually. The plants are visible from the road now. Anyone with eyes, "I know." She folded her hands on the table. "What do you want to do about the letter?" "Same thing I did with the first one." She looked at him steadily. "Wyatt, this one is different." She was right, and he knew it. The first letter had been a man extending a hand before deciding whether to use it. This one was a man who had already decided. He stood up. He walked to the window, then back. He was thinking, and when he was thinking he couldn't stay still, which was something she'd learned about him without ever commenting on. "I need to go into town," he said. "Why?" "Because whatever Crow does next, he's going to do it through official channels. He's not stupid enough to come at this openly. After the irrigation sabotage, too many people would connect it. He'll find something with paper behind it. A land claim, a water rights dispute, something with the county office." Eliza went very still. "A prior claim." He looked at her. "What?" "That's what he did in Hollis County 4 years ago." She said it like she was reading from something she'd memorized. "A rancher named Aldous Burke. Crow found an old territorial land survey that put a disputed boundary through Burke's best pasture. By the time the county finished sorting it out, Burke couldn't afford the legal fees and sold." Wyatt stared at her. "How do you know about Aldous Burke?" "Because I researched Harlan Crow before I ever got on that train." She met his eyes without flinching. "I told you I chose this land, Wyatt. I chose it knowing he was here. I chose it because I had a plan for him too." The silence in the room was the loudest it had ever been. He sat back down. He looked at her across the table, this woman who had shown up with a crate of seeds and a dead man's knowledge, and what he had assumed was simply the determination of someone with nowhere else to go. And what he was understanding now fully for the first time was that she had come here knowing the enemy. She had done her research. She had mapped the terrain, the obstacle, and all before she set foot on it. "What's the plan for him?" he said. She pulled her notebook from her coat pocket. Not the seed journal, a different one smaller with a darker cover. She opened it to a page he'd never seen and turned it to face him. Names, dates, property transactions, notes written in her precise, neat hand going back 7 years of Harlan Crow's activities in 3 counties. "He has a pattern," she said. "He always approaches twice before he moves legally. The second letter means the legal move is coming. She pointed to a line in her notes. In every case, he uses the same land attorney, a man named Fitch based in the county seat. If Fitch files anything against this property, you'll know it's Crow. Wyatt looked at the notebook. He looked at her. You put this together yourself. My father lost everything to a man who moved exactly this way. I paid attention. A pause. I told you that already. You did. He sat back. You didn't tell me you came here with a counter-strategy already written. Something moved in her expression, not quite discomfort, but something close. Would you have let me come if I had? He thought about it honestly. Probably not. I know. She held his gaze. I needed the chance to prove the land first. If I'd walked in with all of this on day one, you would have seen a problem before you saw a solution. I needed you to see the corn first. It was so cleanly strategic that it took him a moment to decide how he felt about it. He sat with the information, turned it around. You managed me, he said. Not accusation. Observation. I worked with what I had, she said. Same as you do with cattle in a drought. He almost smiled. He looked at the notebook again. What do we need to do before Fitch files anything? She was already turning to the next page. What they needed was the county recorder. His name was Howard Briggs, and he was 61 years old, and had worked the Silver Creek County Recorder's office for 23 of those years, and he was as far as anyone in town could establish entirely incorruptible. Not because he was a saint. Howard Briggs drank too much on Saturday nights and owed Pete Dunbar $20 from a card game that Pete was too polite to collect, but because he genuinely loved the orderliness of recorded fact and could not abide anyone who tried to introduce disorder into it. Wyatt had known Howard for 15 years. He'd never asked him for a favor. He went to the county office on a Tuesday morning and found Howard at his desk with a ledger the size of a door. Wyatt Hayes, Howard said without looking up. Haven't seen you since you filed that fence line dispute with McCready. Which we settled. Eventually. Howard set down his pen. He looked at Wyatt over the top of his glasses. What do you need? I need to know if anyone has filed or requested any documents related to my property in the last 60 days. Howard's expression didn't change. He was a man who'd heard a great many things from a great many people in this office and had trained his face into a reliable neutrality. That's a records request, he said. Yes. Those take 3 days. Howard. A pause. Come back tomorrow morning, Howard said, and picked up his pen again. Wyatt came back the next morning. Howard met him at the door rather than at the desk, which meant there was something Howard wanted to say before the official version of the conversation began. Someone requested a survey of your eastern boundary last week, Howard said quietly. Survey of the original territorial grant, specifically the water rights attachment. Wyatt held himself very still. Who requested it? The request came through an attorney's office. Howard paused. Name of Fitch. There it was. He thanked Howard. He rode home. He found Eliza in the east pasture, and he told her, and she listened without interrupting. And when he finished, she said, How long before the survey is complete? Howard didn't know. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Then we have 2 weeks. She was already calculating. The water rights attachment on the original territorial grant, do you have the deed? In the house. In a tin box in the back room. Get it tonight. She turned and started walking toward the house herself. I need to read the original language. He caught up with her in 2 strides. Eliza, what are you looking for? She kept walking. The Alcott family. The people who had this land before your father. They farmed it. That means they had a working irrigation right tied to the creek, not just a water access right. Those are 2 different things under territorial law, and if the original deed specifies farming use... She stopped walking and turned to him abruptly, and there was something blazing behind her eyes that he'd never quite seen at full brightness before. If it specifies farming use, then the water rights on this property are stronger than a grazing-only claim. Crow can't touch them. He stared at her. If the deed says that. Yes. She held his gaze. Get the deed tonight. He got the deed. He brought the tin box to the kitchen table that evening, and she went through it with the lamp pulled close and her notebook open beside her, and he sat across from her and watched her read with the concentration of someone diffusing something that could go either way. An hour passed. 2. She turned a page. She stopped. He leaned forward. Her finger was on a line of text. Old ink on old paper, and she read it aloud in a voice that came out very carefully controlled. All water access and diversion rights attached to said property, to be maintained in perpetuity for agricultural and livestock purposes, as established by initial settlement. Agricultural. Not livestock only. Agricultural. She looked up. He looked back. That's it, she said. Her voice was still careful, but her eyes were not careful at all. That's what he's going to try to reframe. He's going to argue that a cattle operation doesn't constitute agricultural use, under the original language that the water rights should revert to a simple access right that he can then contest. But the farming, she touched the notebook. The farming on the east pasture doesn't just make the ranch more valuable, it protects the water rights. It activates the original language. Wyatt looked at the deed. He thought about 73 rows of corn, now standing knee-high in the east pasture. He thought about Eliza arriving with her crate of seeds. He thought about all the things he hadn't understood on that platform when she stepped off the train and asked him where the driest soil was. You knew, he said. She didn't deny it. I suspected. I needed to see the deed to be certain. The corn isn't just a crop. No. She held his gaze steadily. It never was. He sat back in his chair. Something was moving through him that was too large and too complex to name quickly. Not anger, not exactly, though there was something in the vicinity of that. More like the feeling of being inside a story that was much bigger than the one you thought you were in, and looking up to see the actual dimensions of it for the first time. You used my land, he said. I improved your land, she said. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness cost her something. He could see that. And I saved your water rights. And I brought you a harvest in a drought that was going to take this ranch inside of 2 more years. She paused. I know I didn't tell you everything from the start. I know what that cost in terms of trust, and I'm not going to pretend it didn't. Another pause. Quieter now. But I am telling you now, because now you need to know. The lamp flickered between them. He looked at her for a long time. He looked at the deed. He looked at his own hands on the table, the hands of a man who'd been fighting a losing war with the land for 3 years and hadn't understood until this moment that the tide had turned, and when it had turned, and who had turned it. What do we do with the deed? He finally said. She let out a breath. We file a copy with Howard Briggs tomorrow, formally. On record before Fitch finishes the survey. We document that active farming is occurring on the property and cite the original language. She was back to the plan, back to the precision, but her eyes were watching him carefully. If it's on record before Fitch files anything, Crow has no ground. And if Fitch already filed, then we fight it. She said it without hesitation. With the deed, with Howard's records, with Tom McCready's testimony about the irrigation sabotage if it comes to that. He nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment. Then, why Silver Creek, Eliza, out of every dry county in every state? Why this ranch? She looked at the table. For once, she wasn't immediate with her answer. She turned it over. Your letter, she said finally. You wrote that the land was mostly dry and the herd had thinned and you needed someone practical. She looked up. Most men wrote about themselves, what they'd built, what they owned, what they could offer. You wrote about the land, what it was, what it wasn't anymore. A pause. That told me you paid attention to the land. Not just what it could do for you, what it actually was. She looked back down. I needed a man who paid attention to land, because what I was bringing needed that. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, I'll ride to Howard's first thing in the morning. She nodded. She started gathering the papers back into the tin box with her careful hands. He watched her. He thought about everything she'd carried onto that train in Ohio. The seeds, the notebooks, the plan, the grief for her father. The 15 years of his work packed into a wooden crate, all of it aimed at a piece of land she'd chosen from a letter written by a man who was paying attention. He thought, she didn't just bring seeds, she brought everything. And across the east pasture in the dark and the quiet of a Silver Creek night, the corn grew taller without being watched. Certain unhurried drawing from the deep water that had been waiting underground all along, needing only someone who understood where to look. Howard Briggs filed the copy of the deed at 8:14 in the morning, and he did it with the particular satisfaction of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and why it mattered. Wyatt stood at the counter and watched him stamp the document and enter it into the ledger, and when Howard slid the receipt across the counter, he said without looking up, Fitch hasn't filed anything yet, as of this morning. I know, Wyatt said. You got here first. Howard finally looked up. Don't let anyone tell you timing doesn't matter in this business. Wyatt folded the receipt and put it in his coat. Is there anything else Crow can do through this office? Howard considered it. He could challenge the validity of the original survey, argue the boundary lines were never properly established under statehood law since the grant was territorial. He paused. That's a longer fight, more expensive, and it only works if there's no active use of the land consistent with the original grant terms. There's active farming on the east pasture. Then document it, Howard said. Photographs if you can get them, witness statements, dates of planting acreage crop type. If this goes before a land court, you want a paper record that makes the farming real to someone who's never set foot on your property. Wyatt nodded. He thought of Eliza's notebooks, the dates, the row counts, the growth measurements, the soil samples labeled and stored in the back room of the house. He thought she already did this. She documented everything. She knew before he did that documentation was the armor. He rode home and told her what Howard said. She went to the back room and came out with a stack of notebooks, 3 of them, and set them on the table. I have records from the day I arrived. Every planting date, every measurement, every water usage calculation. She set her hand on the stack. And I need you to get 2 witnesses to come out and formally observe the crop. People whose word carries weight in this county. Tom McCready, he said immediately. Yes, and someone from town. Someone Crow can't claim is partial to you. He thought about it. Reverend Cole. She looked at him. The minister. He's been in Silver Creek 30 years. He's not partial to anyone, he makes a point of it. And no one's going to call him a liar in a land court. She was quiet a moment. Then, ask him. But Reverend Cole came out on a Saturday afternoon and walked the east pasture the way a man walks through something that has changed his understanding of a thing he thought he already understood. He was 67 thin, with the unhurried movements of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by most of what the world showed him. He was surprised now. He walked the full length of the rows. He asked Eliza 2 questions about the planting method, and she answered both directly. At the end, he stood and looked back at the length of the corn, which was at chest height now on a man, and he said very quietly, Your father's work. Yes, Eliza said. And he's gone. Last winter. The Reverend was quiet for a moment. He would have liked to see this. Something moved across Eliza's face that she didn't manage to contain completely. It was there, and then it wasn't, but Wyatt saw it. He was standing close enough to see it, and it was the most unguarded thing he'd ever seen from her, and it cost him something in his chest that he couldn't account for. Yes, she said. He would have. Cole signed the witness statement Eliza had prepared. He signed it carefully with the full weight of a man who understood what his signature meant. On the way out, walking beside Wyatt toward the fence, Cole said quietly, She's extraordinary. Wyatt said nothing. "I'm not sure you fully know that yet," Cole said. Wyatt looked at him. The Reverend gave him a small, uncomplicated smile and mounted his horse. Wyatt stood at the fence a long time after he rode out. The news that something was filed at the county recorder's office reached Harlan Crow the same day Howard Briggs entered it in the ledger, which meant Crow had someone inside the office or very close to it. Wyatt didn't know who and didn't spend energy trying to find out. What mattered was what happened next. What happened next came faster than he expected. It was a Wednesday morning, not quite 2 weeks after the deed filing, and Wyatt was at the south fence when Pete came riding hard again the second time in this story, and Pete's face had the same set to it that it had the first time, the particular tightness of a man about to deliver news he wishes he didn't have. "Crow's in town," Pete said. Wyatt turned. "Since when?" "Rode in this morning. He's at the Silver Creek Hotel. He's brought 3 men with him and a man that people are saying is a lawyer, not Fitch, someone else from the Capitol." Wyatt absorbed this. He escalated. He didn't just escalate. Pete hesitated. The hesitation was unlike him. "Wyatt, he's been talking to people. Around town. I heard it from Clara, who heard it from the woman who does laundry for the hotel. He's been telling people the farming operation on your property is violating water compact agreements, that your irrigation use is drawing more than your legal share from the creek and affecting downstream properties." Wyatt went very still. "That's a lie. I know that, you know that. But he's saying it to the people who don't know that, and some of them are listening because their own wells are low and they're scared, and scared people need somewhere to put it." Pete looked at him steadily. "He's not just fighting you legally, Wyatt. He's turning the town." Wyatt didn't answer immediately. He looked at the south fence. He thought about water compacts and downstream agreements and scared people in a drought county who needed someone to blame. And he thought about Harlan Crow sitting in the Silver Creek Hotel, explaining things in that careful, reasonable tone that men like Crow used when they were doing their worst work. He thought, he's moving on 2 fronts at once. Legal and social. Because one without the other isn't enough anymore. He rode home. Eliza listened to all of it without moving. She was standing at the kitchen counter when he told her, and she stayed there, and her face went through something he could follow if he was paying attention. The calculation, the reassessment, the quick pivot to the new terrain. "He knows the deed filing is solid," she said. "That's why he changed tactics." "Yes. He can't beat it legally on its own, so he needs the town against us. If enough people believe the water compact story, it creates pressure on Howard, on the county commissioner, on anyone who might testify for us." She turned to face him fully. He wants people to see the corn as the problem, something that's taking from them. Can he make it stick? Not with the facts. Our water usage is documented. It's within any reasonable compact interpretation, and Tom McCready's irrigation share hasn't changed since we started. She pressed her hands flat on the counter. "But facts don't matter as much as fear in a drought. So what do we do?" She looked at him. "We go into town." He hadn't expected that. Eliza, not to fight him, not to argue. She pushed away from the counter and moved to get her coat. "To let people see me, to talk to them, to show them the documentation on the water usage and answer their questions directly." She turned with the coat in her hand. "Crow works in the space between people and information. We close that space." He looked at her. He thought about this woman in the middle of Silver Creek, in front of people who had been calling her a foolish bride since she arrived, standing there with her notebooks and her direct gaze and her willingness to answer every question without flinching. "They haven't been kind to you," he said. "I know." She put on the coat. "I'm not asking them to be kind. I'm asking them to be fair." She looked at him. "Are you coming?" He got his hat. Hattie Graves's dry goods store was as good a place as any, because Hattie was the center of the information network, and whatever happened at Hattie's happened everywhere in Silver Creek by sundown. When Wyatt and Eliza walked in, there were 4 women inside, and Hattie behind the counter. And the conversation stopped in the particular way that conversations stop when the subject of them walks through the door. Eliza didn't hesitate. "Mrs. Graves," she said, "I understand there are concerns about the water usage on Hayes land. I'd like to address them directly if you'll give me a few minutes." Hattie looked at her. She looked at Wyatt. She was a woman who respected directness even when she disapproved of nearly everything else, and directness was the one thing Eliza Boone had never been short of. "Go ahead," Hattie said. Eliza opened her notebook on the counter. She walked through the numbers, plainly daily water draw from the irrigation channel, total acreage under irrigation, comparison to the creek's current flow rate, Tom McCready's unchanged allocation. She explained what a water compact actually required under county law, which none of the 4 women in the store had known specifically, and which once stated made Crow's claim look exactly as thin as it was. "The East Pasture irrigation uses less water than a herd of 60 cattle at peak summer drinking," she said. "We're currently running 48 head. The numbers don't support the claim Mr. Crow is making." The room was quiet. Then one of the women, Wyatt recognized her as Mary Aldrin, whose husband ran a small property 2 miles east, said, "Where'd you learn all this?" "My father," Eliza said. "He farmed for 30 years. He lost his land to a man who used the same tactic Mr. Crow is using now. By the time my father understood what was happening, it was too late." She looked at Mary Aldrin directly. "I understand what Mr. Crow is doing because I watched it destroy my family once. I'm not going to let it happen again." The silence in the store was different now. Hattie was looking at Eliza with an expression Wyatt had never seen on Hattie Graves's face before. Not sympathy exactly. Recognition. "You should talk to the men at the feed store," Hattie said. "That's where he's been doing most of his talking." They went to the feed store. There were 7 men inside, which was more than usual for a Wednesday, and Wyatt understood when he walked in that at least some of them had heard Crow had brought men to town and were waiting to see what happened next. The West had always been a place where people showed up to see what happened next. It was both its best and worst quality. Crow was not there. His lawyer was not there. But the space where their words had been was very much present, and Wyatt could feel it the moment he stepped in. He let Eliza lead. She set her notebook on the nearest flat surface, and she talked for 12 minutes, and she answered 8 questions from 7 men, and not one of the 8 questions was easy or gentle. They were the questions of people who had real anxiety about real water in a real drought and needed real answers, and she gave them real answers every time without hedging, without softening, without performing. At the end, Carl Briggs Howard's nephew, a rancher who'd lost a third of his herd this year, said, "If your corn makes it, are you planning to plant more next season?" "Yes," Eliza said, "as much as the water and soil will support. And if anyone in this county wants to know how to test their own soil for the same subsoil moisture conditions, I'll tell them." Carl Briggs looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Wyatt. He nodded once and went back to what he'd been doing when they walked in. That was enough. Not a triumph. Not a reversal. But the tide shifting. On the way out, Wyatt put his hand briefly on the small of her back to guide her around a crate in the doorway, and he felt her almost stop just for a half second, just the smallest pause, before she kept walking. He took his hand away. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. Crow made his move on a Thursday. It came through Fitch after all, not the capital lawyer Fitch, which meant Crow had decided the capital lawyer was for later, and this was the opening shot. Fitch filed a formal challenge to the water rights attachment on the Hayes property, arguing that the original territorial grant language regarding agricultural use had never been validated under statehood law and was therefore unenforceable. Howard Briggs sent word to Wyatt within an hour of the filing. Wyatt brought the notice to Eliza, and she read it at the table, and then she set it down and said, He made a mistake. He filed a challenge. He filed the wrong challenge. She tapped the notice with one finger. He's arguing the agricultural language was never validated under statehood law. But he's wrong about when validation occurred. It wasn't under statehood law. It was under the Federal Land Act of 1875, which supersedes statehood interpretation for original territorial grants in this region. She looked up. If he'd argued the farming operation itself, he might have had something to work with. But this is the wrong statute. A land court will see that in 20 minutes. Wyatt stared at her. Are you certain? My father fought this exact argument in Ohio in 1871 and won. She said it without drama, just fact. I know the statute. I know the case law. He sat down heavily. We need an attorney. We need someone who can write a response citing the correct federal statute before Fitch's filing advances past the preliminary stage. She was already reaching for her notebook. Do you know any attorneys in the county seat? 1. A man named Garrett Walsh. He's handled a few property disputes around here. Get him out here today. He got Walsh out there by late afternoon. Walsh was 53, careful, and had the demeanor of a man who had seen most things and was rarely startled. He was startled by Eliza. Not visibly, he was too professional for that, but Wyatt could see it in the slight pause Walsh took the first time she cited the 1875 federal statute, the pause of a man recalibrating who he was talking to. Walsh spent 2 hours with her going through the deed, the filing, the notebook documentation, and her notes on the federal statute. At the end, he said, "This is a solid response. The statutory argument is correct. Fitch either doesn't know his federal land law or is banking on the idea that you don't." He was banking on the second, Eliza said. Walsh looked at her. I'll draft the response tonight and file tomorrow morning. He glanced at Wyatt. She should be here when we do. She will be, Wyatt said. Walsh left. Pete, who had been sitting quietly in the corner through most of it, looked at Eliza and then at Wyatt and said, Is this almost over? Not yet, Eliza said. But it's closer. After Pete left, the house was quiet. Wyatt poured 2 cups of coffee without being asked and set one in front of her and sat down. And they stayed at the table together for a while without talking, and he was aware of her tiredness not in anything she showed, but in the quality of her stillness, the way a person goes still when they've been running at full capacity for a long time, and the immediate crisis has just released its grip by 1 single degree. He said, When this is over. She looked at him. When this is over. He said again slower, I want to talk. About what? He looked at his coffee. He was not a man who found words easily, and this was the kind of thing that required words, so he took his time finding them. About what happens next, between us, because what we have right now is, I don't know what to call it, but I know it's not the arrangement I wrote in that letter. She was very still. I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I'm not making a demand. I just... He stopped. I want you to know that I see you. Not the plan, not the corn, not the deed or the notebooks or the 15 years of your father's work. You. He looked at her directly. I see you, Eliza. The silence that followed was the longest and the most specific they'd ever shared. She looked down at the coffee cup in her hands. When she looked up, her eyes were doing something she didn't control, that same bright contained thing he'd seen in the east pasture on the night they'd walked the rows together in the dark. When this is over, she said very quietly. When this is over, he agreed. He didn't push. He understood that she needed the battle won before she could let herself want anything beyond it, that the armor she'd built herself in Ohio, in 30 years of watching her father fight and lose, didn't come off easily or all at once. He could wait. He'd learned over the past weeks that some things needed to be waited for, that the most important things drew from something deep and slow and couldn't be rushed without being damaged. He'd learned it from her. He picked up his coffee and she picked up hers, and outside the Silver Creek night pressed in around the house, and somewhere in the east pasture The corn stood in the dark at shoulder height, certain and unhurried, everything underneath it holding. Garrett Walsh filed the response at 9 in the morning on a Friday, and by noon the county seat had it, and by 3 in the afternoon, Wyatt received word through Howard Briggs that the Preliminary Review Board had flagged Fitch's filing for a statutory deficiency hearing, which meant Fitch had 48 hours to either amend his argument or withdraw. Pete heard the news and came into the kitchen with his hat in his hand and the look of a man who wanted to celebrate but wasn't certain the ground was solid enough yet. "Does this mean it's done?" "It means Crow has 48 hours to decide how much this is worth to him," Eliza said. She was at the table with Walsh's copy of the filing, reading it again the way she read everything completely nothing skimmed. If he withdraws, he loses the legal angle. If he amends, he has to find a new argument, and there isn't one that doesn't run into the deed language. "So he's stuck," Pete said. "He's not stuck." She looked up. "He's deciding. There's a difference." She set the papers down. "A man like Crow doesn't run out of moves. He changes the game." Pete looked at Wyatt. Wyatt said, "Go check the intake." Pete went. The 48 hours passed without word from Fitch. No amendment, no withdrawal. Just silence, which Wyatt had learned by now was Crow's way of saying he was working on something that didn't need paperwork. The answer came on a Sunday. It came in the form of 3 men on horseback at the east fence line before dawn, and it was Cal McCready who found them, not Wyatt's men, because Cal had extended the watch rotation without being asked after Pete mentioned the Fitch situation 2 days earlier. Cal was the kind of man who did things before he was asked when he thought they needed doing, and that quality likely saved the crop. He rode to the house and hammered on the door at 5 in the morning, and Wyatt was up and dressed and outside in under 3 minutes. 3 men, Cal said. East fence far corner. They had something with them. I couldn't see what in the dark, but they were on foot by the fence line, and one of them was carrying something low. Did they get into the field? I don't know. I came straight here. Wyatt was already moving to the barn. He looked back at the house, and Eliza was in the doorway, fully dressed, her coat on, reading his face. "Go," she said. "I'll get Pete." He and Cal rode to the east fence in the gray pre-dawn, and what they found at the far corner made Wyatt's jaw lock hard enough to ache. The fence had been cut, not broken, cut deliberately and cleanly. A section of wire pulled back and laid aside, and on the ground just inside the field line, spilled from what had been a sealed tin container, was a pool of something dark that had already soaked into the soil at the base of 3 plants. He crouched. He smelled it before he touched it. Oil. Some kind of mineral oil mixture, the kind used in certain weed treatments, the kind that would poison soil contact and kill root systems within days if left. He stood up. Cal was beside him, looking at the plants, then at the container, then at Wyatt. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "How far did it spread?" Cal said finally. "Depends on how long ago." Wyatt looked at the surrounding soil. The contamination was contained 3 plants, maybe 5, not more. Cal had gotten there before they finished. They were interrupted. "They ran when they heard me coming." "You saved the crop, Cal." Cal shook his head. "My grandfather ran cattle on land that dried up and died because no one helped him hold it. I wasn't going to watch that happen to someone else." He looked at the damaged plants. "What do you need?" "I need you to ride to Howard Briggs right now and tell him what you found. Don't clean anything up. Leave the container, leave the wire, leave the ground as it is. I need a record of this." Cal was already turning his horse. "Cal?" He looked back. "Thank you." Cal rode. Eliza arrived at the east fence 10 minutes later with Pete beside her, and she went straight to the damaged section without speaking and crouched at the soil line and smelled the ground the same way Wyatt had. She stood up. Her face was doing something he'd only seen once before on the night she'd told him she didn't come here to lose this. Not anger, not tears, Something harder and more permanent than either of those. The specific expression of a person who has had something precious damaged and has decided in real time exactly what they are going to do about it. 3 plants, she said. Maybe 5. The root contamination might go wider than the surface. I can dig them out today. Create a containment boundary around the affected soil. If the contamination hasn't reached the water table... She stopped. She was calculating faster than she was talking. It won't reach the water table. The soil here doesn't drain straight down, it moves laterally. I know this soil. She looked at Wyatt. I can save the rest of the field. I know you can. He said it without hesitation, without qualification, the way you say something you're completely certain of. Something in her face shifted at that. Not the armor coming down, just a crack in it, just enough. She turned back to the field and started working. China. Howard Briggs came out personally, which was not something the county recorder typically did, and he brought with him a man named Dale Purcell, who served as the county's land dispute witness officer, a position that most Silver Creek residents hadn't known existed until this morning. Howard was angry in the quiet way of a man who takes the integrity of records and legal process as something close to sacred, and what he was looking at in this field was a violation of that integrity made physical. He documented everything: the wire, the container, the soil damage, the location relative to the recorded agricultural use filing. He did it methodically and without comment, and when he was finished, he said to Wyatt, "This constitutes criminal interference with a recorded agricultural operation. That's a different matter than the land dispute." "I know. Do you want to pursue it?" Wyatt looked at Eliza, who was 20 yards away on her knees at the contamination boundary, working with a methodical focus that made everyone else on that field feel slightly ashamed of how much less they were capable of. "Yes," he said. "Pursue it." Howard nodded. "I'll have the documentation to the county sheriff by this afternoon." He left. Pete watched him go, and then said quietly beside Wyatt, "Crow's not going to like that." "No," Wyatt said. "He's not." "You ready for what comes after he doesn't like it?" Wyatt watched Eliza work. He watched her dig with precision and speed, pulling contaminated soil away from the root systems, with a care that was almost surgical, protecting what could be protected and sacrificing what was already lost with the specific ruthlessness of a person who knows how to triage. "Yes," he said. What came after was Harlan Crow himself. He came to the ranch on a Tuesday, which was brazen enough that Wyatt nearly respected it. He came alone, no lawyer, no hired men, and he knocked on the front door like a man paying a social call. And when Wyatt opened it, Crow was standing there in good clothes, with his hat in his hand, and an expression of practiced reasonableness that had probably worked on a great many people in his life. He was 55, broad through the shoulders, with gray at his temples, and the specific look of a man who had won enough to believe that winning was simply his natural condition. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "I'd like to talk." Wyatt looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the door. Crow came in. He saw Eliza at the table. She hadn't moved when she heard the knock, had stayed exactly where she was with her notebook open. And he gave her the kind of nod a man gives when he's acknowledging an obstacle he's decided to treat as a minor one. Eliza looked at him with an expression of complete neutrality and said nothing. Crow sat down across from her without being invited. Wyatt stayed standing. "I'm going to be direct," Crow said. "That'll be a change," Eliza said. A pause. He looked at her with the first real attention he'd given her. "You're smarter than I expected." "Most people are," she said. He almost smiled. "Here's where we are. The filing is a problem I can manage. The criminal complaint is an irritation my men acted without my instruction, and I'll deal with that internally." He said the last part as though it were a minor administrative matter. "But the real issue is that this land has something I need, and you have something I can use." He looked at Wyatt. "I'm prepared to offer a partnership." The word landed strangely in the room. "A partnership," Wyatt said. Your water rights properly documented and now legally bulletproof, thanks to your filing combined with my capital and my regional land holdings, would create something significant in this valley. I'm not your enemy, Hayes. I'm a practical man who made a miscalculation about how far you'd fight. He spread his hands on the table. I can work with people who fight. The room was silent. Wyatt looked at Eliza. She was looking at Crow with the focused attention of someone reading fine print. You're offering to buy in, she said. I'm offering to partner. After sabotaging our irrigation, after filing a false legal challenge, after sending men to poison the crop. She said each item plainly without heat, the way you read items from a list. You're offering to partner. Business is complicated. No. She closed her notebook. It isn't. Not this part. She looked at him with something he clearly hadn't expected, not anger, not triumph, just an absolute clarity that had no performance in it at all. You came here because you thought we'd be desperate enough to take whatever you offered. We're not desperate, we're not selling, and we're not partnering. The criminal complaint stands. The water rights are recorded. The crop will make it to harvest. She held his gaze. You've run out of moves, Mr. Crow. Crow looked at her for a long time. He looked at Wyatt. Wyatt said, You heard her. Something moved in Crow's face. The practiced reasonableness slipped just briefly, and underneath it was the expression of a man who is not accustomed to the word no coming from a direction he underestimated. He put his hat back on. He stood. At the door he stopped and looked back one last time, the way men like Crow always do, needing the last word, needing some fragment of advantage to carry out. The drought will come back, he said. It always does. Yes, Eliza said. And the corn will still grow. He left. The door closed. Pete, who had been standing in the kitchen doorway through the whole exchange, let out a breath that had apparently been held for some time. Wyatt looked at Eliza. She was looking at the closed door, and then she turned and looked at him, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. And then she laughed a short, genuine sound that surprised both of them, because he had never heard her laugh before. Not like that, not unguarded and real, and he found himself smiling in a way that changed his whole face. He actually thought that would work, she said. He's used to it working. I know. She shook her head. His mistake was thinking this was only about the land. He looked at her. What else was it about? She met his eyes. It was about what the land means, what it can become. A pause. What we built on it. The word we sat between them. He let it sit there. The harvest came in August. It came with the particular silence of something enormous arriving without announcement one morning. The corn was tall and full and ready, and Eliza walked the rows, the way she had walked them since the beginning, checking, measuring her hand, moving along the stalks, with the ease of someone touching something she knows completely. Wyatt walked beside her. Tom McCready came with Cal and two of their hands. Pete brought Ruth, who had asked to be there, and hadn't explained why, but didn't need to. Reverend Cole came on his old horse and tied it at the fence and walked in without ceremony. Carl Briggs came. Clara Hensley came. Howard Briggs came. They came without being summoned the way people come when something is real enough to be worth standing next to. The first ear Eliza harvested she did by hand, cutting it clean from the stalk with a single motion, and she stood there holding it. And the field behind her was full of people who 3 months ago had called this a foolish bride's foolish gamble, and not one of them was saying that now. Ruth was crying. She didn't try to hide it. Pete put his arm around her and looked at the corn with the expression of a man who has had his faith in something restored that he hadn't realized he'd lost. Tom McCready stood beside Wyatt and said, "My grandfather would have called this a miracle." "It's not a miracle," Wyatt said. "It's 15 years of her father's work and everything she knew how to do with it." Tom was quiet. Then, "Same thing from where I'm standing." Wyatt looked at Eliza across the field. She was talking to Carl Briggs, her notebook open, showing him something on the page, already thinking about next season, already planning, already looking at the land, and seeing what it could become with the right knowledge and the right care. He watched her. He thought about a February night, and a cracked table, and a letter he'd written by a dying lamp. He thought about what he'd asked for, and what had arrived instead, and he thought that a man could spend his whole life being grateful for the gap between those two things. He crossed the field to her. Briggs drifted away tactfully when he saw Wyatt coming the way people do when they sense something between two people that doesn't need an audience. Eliza looked up when he reached her. "It's a good harvest," she said. Not the biggest the contaminated section had cost them, and the late-season dry spell had thinned 2 rows at the north end, but real and solid and undeniably here. "Yes," he said. "Next season, if we extend the planting to the north section and redirect the secondary irrigation channel, we can increase yield by 1/3. I've been looking at the soil data and—" "Eliza." She stopped. He looked at her directly. He had spent a lot of time in his life not saying the things that needed saying, and he had made a decision somewhere between August and now that he was done with that particular habit. "I told you when this was over we'd talk," he said. "Yes." "It's over." She looked at him. The notebook was still open in her hand, the pen still in her fingers, and she looked at him with the full weight of everything she was. The 15 years of her father's work, the plan she'd carried alone across 1,000 miles, the armor she'd built in Ohio and worn every day since, and underneath all of it, the woman who had walked the rows in the dark because she couldn't sleep for worrying about something she loved. "What do you want to say?" she asked. Her voice was quiet. "I want to say that I'm done calling this an arrangement." He looked at her steadily. "And I'm done pretending I don't know what you are to me." She was very still. "You didn't come here to be my wife," he said. "I know that. You came here for the land, for the crop, for your father's work. I know all of that." He held her gaze. "But you stayed for more than that. We both did." He paused. "I'm asking you plainly and without any kind of arrangement around it, stay. Not because of the ranch, not because of the corn, because I want you here." The harvest field was full of people, full of voices, and the sound of corn being cut and horses at the fence, and in the middle of all of it, Eliza Boone stood still and looked at Wyatt Hayes, and the armor came down, not piece by piece, but all at once, the way it comes down for a person who has finally decided they are safe enough to let it. "I chose this land," she said. Her voice was rough at the edges, in a way he'd never heard before. "I chose it off a letter. I chose it before I ever set foot on it. I know. I need you to understand what that means." She looked at him with everything showing the grief for her father, the years of planning, the fear she'd never spoken out loud, that the land would fail and the seeds would have nowhere to go, and everything her father built would end with her. "I didn't come here willing to fail. I came here because I believed in this place before you did." "I know that too," he said. "I've known it since the first morning you were up before me with a diagram of my own pasture." He reached out and took the notebook from her hand and closed it gently and held it because she needed her hands free for what came next. "You believed in my land before I did. Now I'm asking you to believe in this." She looked at his hand holding her notebook. She looked at his face. Then she said very quietly, "I already do." He took her hand. She let him. Behind them, Pete said something to Ruth that made her laugh, and Tom McCready called something across the field to Cal, and Reverend Cole stood at the edge of the north row with his hat off and his face turned up in the particular expression of a man quietly thanking something he believes in. And the corn stood tall across the whole of the east pasture, green and full and undeniable. Everything the drought had said was impossible, made true by a woman who had understood the land before she ever touched it. That evening, when the others had gone, and the last of the harvest was stacked and accounted for, Wyatt and Eliza sat on the porch together in the cooling air, and she had his hand still, or he had hers. Neither of them could have said where one ended and the other began, and the ranch spread out around them in the early dark, the cattle quiet in the south pasture, the corn rows standing in the east, the creek running in the distance with its steady, unhurried sound. "I thought I ordered a bride," he said. She looked at him. In the dark, her face was open and real and entirely her own. "No," she said, and the warmth in her voice was something new, something she had been keeping in reserve for a moment exactly like this one. "You wrote a letter to the land. I just answered it." He looked out at everything they had built, the crop that wasn't supposed to grow, the water rights that were stronger now than they'd ever been, the ranch that had been dying and was alive, and the woman beside him who had seen all of it before it existed and had crossed 1,000 miles to make it real. He tightened his hand around hers. This was not the life he had written in that letter. It was larger than that and harder and more fully his than anything he had ever owned, because it was not something he had been given or something he had simply endured, but something the two of them had fought for together, side by side in the same direction, and what they had built on this dry and doubted ground.